Hey, 42 here. Napoleon Bonaparte is one of the most influential people in the history of mankind. And you don't have to take my word for it. That was the conclusion reached in the 2013 book, Who's Bigger?, which ranked historical figures in order of their significance. Of the 100 billion or so members of our species that have lived and died to date, Napoleon Bonaparte came second. The French meet in a religious sandwich between Jesus Christ and the Prophet Muhammad. Napoleon is probably most famous today for his brilliance as a general. He led his troops in more than 80 battles, winning a staggering 90% of them. No other general in recorded history can even come close to matching those numbers. He practically invented modern warfare, and it's no exaggeration to say that he is probably the greatest military genius that's ever lived. But his story is a surprising one. For example, did you know that the most famous Frenchman in history didn't even speak French until he was 10 years old? Or that he very nearly gave up on his military career to write saucy romance novels? Neither did I. And there's more. When he wasn't terrorizing the rest of Europe, Napoleon found the time to broker the biggest deal in the history of real estate, accidentally helped mankind to translate Egyptian hieroglyphics, and put together legal, economic, and educational reforms that quite literally changed the world. Oh, and one of his distant relatives was the voice actor who played Chef Louis in The Little Mermaid. I think that might actually be my favorite random interesting fact of all time. There's really no other way of saying it. Napoleon Bonaparte lived one of the most incredible lives in history. Here's how it went. By the way, if, like me, you also think it's about time to do something to protect our planet's ecosystems, stick around until the end. There I have an inspiring recommendation from my friends at Planet Wild, an environmental protection organization that you won't want to miss. Napoleon was born on the French island of Corsica on the 15th of August, 1769. Well, I say French island. Just 3 months before Napoleon executed his first successful military advance through his mother's birth canal, Corsica had been an independent sovereign state. The French invaded after buying it from former owners, the Republic of Genoa, and most of the locals, understandably, weren't too happy about it. Despite being 6 months pregnant, Napoleon's mother, along with his father, joined the Corsican resistance, fighting a bloody guerrilla war against the French invaders. Most historians consider the Siege of Toulon to be his first major battle, but I beg to differ. Baby Bonaparte took part in his first war as a fetus. It ended up being one of the few losses of his career. France was the richest, most populous country in Europe at the time, and the Corsicans never really stood a chance. But anti-French sentiment remained high amongst much of the population, including the young Napoleon, which is why he wasn't best pleased when, at the age of 9, his father shipped him off to a fancy French boarding school on the mainland. It was a big change for Napoleon, and he absolutely hated it. Technically speaking, he was as French as a camembert baguette, but he couldn't have felt more foreign, which isn't all that surprising really, considering he didn't actually speak French, only Corsican and Italian. He picked up the lingo pretty quickly, but he would never lose his Corsican accent, even as an adult. A year later, he earned a scholarship to the prestigious military academy at Brienne-le-Château, and he despised it every bit as much as he hated boarding school. His classmates were all the sons of French aristocracy, and whilst Napoleon himself descended from minor Italian nobility, his family were by no means rich. He graduated military school at the age of 16 and got his first army posting as a second lieutenant in an artillery unit. He learned fast, and before long he was one of the most capable soldiers in his unit. But the promotions he felt he deserved never came. French society at the time was based on a strict hierarchy. First came the church, then the aristocracy, and finally the commoners. Napoleon was technically part of the aristocracy, but if noblemen were supermarkets, he would have been Asda. And if you wanted to reach the most senior positions in the army, you had to be Waitrose. No matter how hard he worked or how good he was, Napoleon would always be held back by his heritage. Or at least, that's what he thought. But then, the French Revolution happened. The social hierarchy that had governed French society for centuries was torn to shreds as revolutionists overthrew the monarchy and stripped the aristocracy of their privileges. King Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette were given the guillotine treatment. And France was declared a republic ruled by politicians elected by popular vote. The French Revolution wasn't televised, obviously, but word still got around, and when the rest of Europe heard what was going on in France, they weren't best pleased. In fact, they were furious. Most countries in Europe had monarchies and aristocracies of their own, and the revolutionary ideas coming out of France posed an existential threat to all of them. And so, Europe's venerable leaders decided to resolve their ideological differences like the gentlemen of culture they were. Just kidding. They went to war. Great Britain, the Holy Roman Empire, Portugal, Prussia, Sardinia, Spain, and several other countries formed the mother of all tag teams to lay the absolute smackdown on revolutionary France. The War of the First Coalition had begun. For your average Frenchman, having half a continent declare war on you was probably quite scary. But for Napoleon Bonaparte, it was like Christmas had come early. There was suddenly a massive demand for capable military men to lead France's army against her countless enemies, and you didn't even need to have stepped foot in a Waitrose to get the job. His first taste of leadership came in 1793 after royalist rebels, supported by British and Spanish ships, seized the port of the city of Toulon. Napoleon came up with a bold plan to liberate the city by storming a hilltop fort in the middle of the night and turning its cannons on the coalition ships blockading the harbour. He led the attack himself, taking a bayonet to the thigh in the process, but the plan worked a treat. A 24-year-old Napoleon had just won his first significant battle, and the world got its first glimpse of what the greatest military genius in history was capable of. Napoleon was promoted to Brigadier General, but just when it seemed his grand military ambitions would finally be fulfilled, they were dealt a significant blow. His first posting was to put down a royalist rebellion in western France, but he considered the task to be beneath his considerable talents. And so he did what any grown man does when faced with a job he doesn't really fancy. He pulled a sickie. He was so miffed he even attempted a wild career change, writing a saucy romance novel where the leading man bore a striking resemblance to Napoleon himself. He was removed from the French army's list of available generals, and for a while it looked like his military career was over before it had really begun. But that changed in October 1795, when 25,000 soldiers launched a devastating assault on the city of Paris. These soldiers weren't British, and they weren't Portuguese or Prussian either. In fact, the army didn't belong to any of the coalition nations. It was French, a huge royalist uprising intent on overthrowing the new government and reinstating the monarchy. If it was successful, the French Revolution was over. With only 5,000 Republican soldiers in the capital at the time, the defenders were outnumbered 5-1, and to make matters worse, there wasn't really anyone to lead them. Almost all of the senior officers in the army had been members of the aristocracy, and many had fled at the outbreak of the revolution. But as luck would have it, a promising romance novelist by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte happened to be in Paris at the time. He was asked to join the fight, and he agreed, on just one condition: that he be given command. He had fewer than 24 hours to make his preparations, but he used the time wisely, concentrating his men at choke points in the streets around the Tuileries Palace, seat of the new government, and setting up artillery at strategic points to create kill zones. The Royalists launched their first assault in the early hours of the morning of the 5th of October, and when the fighting began, Napoleon was right there in the thick of it, staying on the front lines even after his horse was shot out from underneath him. His hastily assembled defensive positions were so effective, they not only held, he lost fewer than 100 men as he convincingly defeated the significantly larger Royalist army. And just like that, he went from angsty romance author to saviour of the Revolution. Still only 26 at the time, Napoleon was promoted to General-in-Chief and given full command of the French army in northern Italy. He got his first look at his brand new army in March 1796, but what he saw wasn't exactly encouraging. Of the 13 field armies under French control at the time, Napoleon's was by far the weakest. His soldiers were malnourished, poorly equipped, and most of them hadn't been paid for months. Morale was so low that several units had mutinied, and many more were on the brink. Of 63,000 troops at Napoleon's disposal, just 38,000 were considered battle-ready. And to make matters worse, northern Italy was a coalition stronghold, with Austrian and Sardinian armies swarming all over the place. Despite the condition of his troops, Napoleon surprised everyone by going on the offensive within just 2 weeks of arriving in Italy. And apparently, a fortnight was all he'd needed to turn his ragtag band of mutinous mercenaries into a lethal fighting machine. Because in his very first battle as a fully fledged general, he absolutely obliterated a joint Sardinian-Austrian army 30 miles west of Genoa. At the end of the battle, 3,500 enemy soldiers were dead. Napoleon had lost just 200 men. Over the course of the next 12 months, commanding what was supposed to be France's weakest field army against more experienced generals in a territory where he was heavily outnumbered, Napoleon went on an absolute rampage, winning 19 of his 21 battles. The coalition forces were so comprehensively beaten by the rookie general that they were forced to sue for peace, relinquishing control of northern Italy to the French. Napoleon had ended the War of the First Coalition pretty much on his own, with all of the Allies, barring Britain, throwing in the towel by signing the Treaty of Campo Formio. That left the two biggest bullies in the European playground doing what they do best, calling each other rude names across the English Channel. After one particularly spicy insult that probably involved frog legs or something, the French briefly considered a full-on invasion led by Napoleon. But after months of planning, he concluded that he didn't have enough ships to tackle the might of the Royal Navy. At least, not yet. That left him with two choices: sit around being all peaceful for a bit, or find someone else to beat up. No prizes for guessing which he went for. At first, his choice of a target, Egypt, seemed a little bit random, but Napoleon had a cunning plan. At the turn of the 19th century, Britain was one of the wealthiest countries on Earth, and a large proportion of that cash money came from British India. British trade ships made the journey to the subcontinent by sailing around Africa, but communication between the two nations usually went through the Middle East for the simple reason that it was much faster. Invading Egypt was a double whammy. Not only would it disrupt Britain's links to India, it would also provide a staging point for a future French invasion. As far as plans go, it was a bold one. But when Napoleon laid it out before the French government, they agreed to it so quickly, it was almost a little bit suspicious. You see, by this point, Napoleon wasn't just France's deadliest weapon, he was also a national hero. And that was a potentially dangerous combination. Rumors were beginning to spread that sooner or later the young general would make a bid for power. By shipping him off to Egypt for a year or two, the Republican government was protecting itself as much as damaging the British. On the 19th of May, 1798, Napoleon's Egyptian invasion force of some 40,000 men set sail for North Africa. But it wasn't just soldiers on board those ships. Napoleon had recently been elected to the French Academy of Sciences, and he realized that this new role gave him the opportunity to spin his invasion not as a war of expansion, but as an expedition of enlightenment. To make it all seem a bit more legit, he brought close to 200 scientists along for the ride. More on what they got up to in a minute. The fleet landed in Egypt on the 1st of July 1798, quickly capturing the city of Alexandria. From there, Napoleon marched about half of his force across the desert to Cairo, where he found 40,000 angry Ottoman soldiers waiting for him a stone's throw away from the pyramids. By this point, everyone in Europe had figured out that Napoleon was basically a cheat code and wasn't to be messed with. But this wasn't Europe. The Ottoman soldiers had no idea who they were dealing with, and since they outnumbered their enemy 2-1, they quite understandably expected an easy victory. And that's exactly what it was, just not for them. In fact, the Battle of the Pyramids was one of the most one-sided engagements in the history of warfare. The Ottoman cavalry was legendary, and faced with wave after wave of charges, Napoleon casually came up with a brand new tactic, arranging his riflemen into enormous rectangles so that they couldn't be flanked. At the cost of just 289 French lives, more than 10,000 Ottoman soldiers were killed, and Egypt belonged to France. Not that Napoleon got to enjoy his latest absolutely ridiculous victory for long, because it turned out that the British had known about his little invasion force all along. They just weren't sure exactly where Napoleon was planning to invade, so they dispatched Rear Admiral Horatio Nelson to go and find out. Heading a large fleet of his own, Nelson had spent the previous 2 months bouncing around the Mediterranean like a ship-based DVD screensaver. And so, on the 1st of August, he finally found the French fleet anchored 20 miles northeast of Alexandria. The ensuing skirmish was every bit as one-sided as the Battle of the Pyramids, only this time, it was the French getting their arses handed to them. Their fleet was almost entirely destroyed, leaving Napoleon's army trapped in Egypt. Since going home was no longer an option, Napoleon figured he might as well do a bit more conquering. So he pushed east into Ottoman-held Syria, capturing several coastal settlements along the way. But completely cut off from France, he had no means of resupplying his army, and the casualties were mounting. Things got even worse when an outbreak of bubonic plague killed hundreds of his soldiers, and the French army was eventually defeated after trying and failing to capture the city of Acre. A good general knows when to retreat, and that's exactly what Napoleon did next. But without any ships, there wasn't anywhere to retreat to. In the end, he left Egypt in secret, sneaking away on a small vessel in the middle of the night. His army didn't even know he'd gone. Dick move, Napoleon. Dick move. Oh, and remember those 200 scientists he brought along? If you're wondering what they were up to while all of this nonsense was going on, they were busy making what is universally regarded as one of the greatest archaeological finds in history. Whilst shoring up the defences of Fort Julian on the west bank of the Nile, they discovered a strange slab of rock covered in ancient writing built right into one of the walls. Known today as the Rosetta Stone, it would later prove to be the key to deciphering ancient hieroglyphics, giving birth to the field of Egyptology in the process. Anyway, Napoleon arrived back in France in October 1799 to find the entire country had gone to shit in his absence. When the rest of Europe had found out that the French Special Scientific Operation in Egypt was actually a fully fledged invasion, they decided to form another tag team, kicking off the War of the Second Coalition. But this time, with their best general in Egypt making Ottoman soldiers beg for their mummies, France was losing badly. Public opinion was wavering, and the new French government was on the verge of collapse. One of Napoleon's greatest strengths as a general was taking advantage of the enemy's weaknesses, but it turns out he was just as good at exploiting weaknesses on his own side too. On the 9th of November 1799, he gathered his closest allies and overthrew the French government in a coup d'etat, installing himself as First Consul and ruler of France. The French Revolution was officially over, and rather than an all-powerful monarch, France now had an all-powerful Napoleon in charge instead. And his first order of business was to quash that pesky Second Coalition. Whilst he'd been gallivanting around Egypt, the Austrians had snuck back into France's territory in northern Italy. You might assume that now Napoleon was the ruler of France, he would leave the dirty business of fighting to his generals. But no. Surprising absolutely everyone, including his own men, he personally led a huge army over the Swiss Alps, sneaking up on a significantly larger Austrian force that was besieging Genoa. From there, things went pretty predictably. Napoleon won a string of battles against the odds, and 2 weeks later, the War of the Second Coalition was over. This time, even Britain agreed to call it quits. For the first time in over 10 years, Europe was at peace. Spoiler alert, it didn't last very long. With no enemy armies to embarrass for the moment, Napoleon had time to catch up on a bit of admin back in Paris. This was the first chance for the French public to see what the legendary general was like at governing, and it turned out he was, well, spectacular. During his years in power, Napoleon completely revolutionized almost every aspect of French society. He introduced a Napoleonic Code, which comprehensively reformed and codified civil law across the whole of France for the first time. He modernized the school system, greatly improving the number and quality of schools. He created the Bank of France and reworked the tax system to help the nation recover from the economic toll of the revolution. And he modernized Paris almost beyond recognition. But before we call him the greatest leader ever, there was a darker side to Napoleon's rule. For one thing, most of the reforms he introduced only benefited about half of the French population. The half with penises. Under Napoleon, women had many of the basic rights they'd enjoyed under the monarchy removed entirely. Then there was slavery. The French Revolution was founded on the idea that all men were equal, and one of its major accomplishments was the abolishment of slavery across the empire. But Napoleon quietly reintroduced it in the French Caribbean to help speed up his plans for colonization in the New World. Despite these major shortcomings in the eyes of the French people, well, half of them, Napoleon could do no wrong. And apparently, he agreed, because in the spring of 1802, he gave himself a little promotion from First Consul to First Consul for life. Peace in Europe also gave Napoleon time to dabble in his new side hustle, real estate. And when I say dabble, I mean he sold over 800,000 square miles of land to the US in what was and still is the single biggest real estate deal in human history. Known today as the Louisiana Purchase, it roughly doubled the size of the United States of America and changed the course of world history in the process. Back in Europe, tensions between France and Britain were rising, and in 1803, British decided to cut the foreplay and declared war. The War of the Third Coalition had begun. Although, to begin with, that coalition was made up of, well, it was just Britain. We really hated the French back then. By this point, Napoleon was either the greatest man alive or the biggest arsehole on the planet. It mostly depended on whether or not you were French, and whether you had a penis. Either way, there must have been quite a lot of people in Camp Arsehole, because during Napoleon's reign he survived at least 30 assassination attempts, and all of those people trying to murder him got him thinking, what would happen to France when he died? Consul for life was great and all, but Napoleon didn't want to just be in charge as long as he lived. He wanted to rule forever, and that meant it was time for another promotion. In December 1804, in one of the most opulent ceremonies ever witnessed, Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself Emperor of France. The new job title didn't necessarily increase his power, that was already absolute, but it did mean he could pass on his title to his sons when he died. His legacy was assured. Now, fully evolved into his Emperor End form, Napoleon Bonaparte started to play gotta catch 'em all with the countries of Europe. Playing the part of Team Rocket were coalitions 3, 4, and 5, and Napoleon defeated them just as easily as he'd beaten the first two. To help fight what were now continent-spanning wars, Napoleon essentially invented the concept of mass conscription, drawing fresh troops from across the ever-expanding French Empire. At its peak, his army contained some 600,000 men, almost 3 times as many soldiers as the British army at the time. Such a large force was an absolute nightmare to control in the days before the radio, so Napoleon came up with a completely new way of organizing his troops. You're probably familiar with the concept of military corps. Well, it turns out Napoleon invented that. He split his army up into individual mixed arms subdivisions that functioned like mini armies, able to act independently. As a result, Napoleon's giant army was significantly faster and much more flexible than any other, which was especially useful whenever he felt like pulling off his signature Mortal Kombat finishing move, the total envelopment of the enemy. Europe was powerless against him. During his reign, he deleted the Holy Roman Empire, a dynasty that had stood for over 1,000 years, defeated the powerful Austrian Empire no fewer than 4 times, and won countless battles when outnumbered and outgunned, often suffering miraculously minor casualties. By 1812, the French Empire spanned most of the continent, and Napoleon had installed multiple family members on various thrones around Europe. But there were 2 notable absentees from his growing collection of countries: Great Britain and Russia. In 1805, Napoleon's Nile nemesis Nelson had nixed a combined French and Spanish fleet in the Battle of Trafalgar, and Napoleon had never managed to rebuild it. That meant an invasion of Britain was almost impossible now, so he turned his attention to Russia instead. On the 24th of June 1812, 500,000 French soldiers marched into Russia. After more than a decade of watching Napoleon kick the crap out of anyone who dared to challenge him, the Russians had absolutely zero interest in trying to defeat him in the field. The man was obviously invincible. Instead, they executed a military maneuver that most of Europe had plenty of practice at by this point: the all-out retreat. As they fell back, the Russians burned everything that might have been used by the French army, from buildings to fields and key infrastructure. That put a huge strain on Napoleon's supply lines, which only worsened the deeper into Russian territory the French army pushed. It didn't help that conditions were awful. The summer of 1812 was unusually hot, and combined with the long, forced marches and the lack of food, Napoleon's troops, many of whom had been conscripted from across the empire, were starting to desert. As the Russian armies moonwalked their way ever deeper into friendly territory, Napoleon's army was weakening. By the time the Russians turned to fight during the Battle of Borodino, he was outnumbered. He won, as always, but this time French losses were enormous. Still, the victory did allow Napoleon to occupy Moscow, meaning he'd done the impossible and defeated Russia. There was just one problem. Nobody had told the Russians. Napoleon waited patiently for his conquered foe to sue for peace, but they didn't. In fact, they didn't do anything. And the French emperor was left pottering around Moscow, looking for odd jobs that needed doing, like a pensioner trying to keep himself busy after retirement. As days turned into weeks, he slowly began to realize he'd made a massive mistake. His crippled army was over 1,000 miles from home, and in the words of Ned Stark, winter was coming. If he'd stayed in Moscow, he'd be trapped. And so he did the only thing he could: retreat. Unfortunately, by that point, winter wasn't just coming, it was already bloody everywhere. Napoleon had marched into Russia at the height of summer, and now in the midst of winter, his men had no provisions for the frigid conditions of the retreat. Tens of thousands died from cold, starvation, or disease, and tens of thousands more were killed by Russian raids. Of the 500,000 troops that marched into Russia in June 1812, just 40,000 made it out alive. For the first time in more than a decade, the invincible Napoleon Bonaparte was weak. Knowing his enemies were waiting to pounce, he rushed back to Paris to raise another army, quickly gathering a force of over 350,000 men, but they were mostly rookies. It's hard to keep track, but by this point Europe had cobbled together its 6th coalition to try and deal with the Napoleon problem. This time made up of Prussia, Russia, Spain, Portugal, Sweden, the United Kingdom, and several smaller German states. Despite being vastly outnumbered and commanding an inexperienced army, Napoleon used all his genius to score several major victories against the Allies. But it wasn't enough. With attacks coming in on multiple fronts and much of the French army in full retreat, Napoleon was eventually defeated in the Battle of Leipzig. He was eventually forced to abdicate, and Louis XVIII, brother of the previous, recently guillotined king, took the throne. Napoleon was sent into exile on the island of Elba off the coast of Tuscany. As a mark of respect, or possibly just to piss him off, the Allies named him Emperor of his new domain. Whatever the motivation, Napoleon took this role seriously, introducing his customary sweeping reforms. In just 9 months, he created a mini-army, a navy, invested in the island's infrastructure, introduced modern agricultural methods, established an iron mine, and updated Elba's legal and educational systems. But after having controlled most of Europe, a small island was never going to be enough. Leading a micro-army of 700 men, he escaped, landing in France on the 1st of March 1815. Even led by the legendary Napoleon, 700 men should have posed zero threat to France. But the newly installed king made a fatal error. He sent a huge army to destroy Napoleon once and for all. A huge army made up of soldiers who utterly adored their former general. The king's army promptly switched sides and began marching on Paris. Apparently a bit of a slow learner, Louis XVIII sent yet another, even bigger army to take down Napoleon. And yeah, that one defected as well. The king briefly considered sending yet another army, then thought better of it and fled to Belgium. On the 20th of March 1815, Napoleon marched into Paris at the head of his new army. The king had returned. The rest of Europe responded to this unwelcome news the only way they knew how, by forming yet another coalition. We're on the 7th now, by the way, just in case you're keeping score. Napoleon did his best to raise a new army, but there simply wasn't the time, and that left him with 2 choices. Either turtle up and attempt to defend France against the incoming coalition invasions, or go on the offensive. As you can probably guess, he opted for the latter, hoping to score some trademark quick victories and force the Allies to sue for peace so that he could properly rebuild. It almost worked. He led the bulk of his force north into what was then the United Kingdom of the Netherlands, and is now Belgium, where he found himself heavily outnumbered by 2 coalition armies, one British, one Prussian. Fighting both at the same time would have been suicide. So, Napoleon separated the armies by sending the bulk of his forces between their positions. From there, he was able to quickly defeat the Prussians. But the British army, commanded by the Duke of Wellington, put up fierce resistance after taking a defensive position near the town that gave the battle its name, Waterloo. It gave the beaten Prussian army just enough time to regroup and attack Napoleon's right flank, rousing the French army. After winning the first 5 coalition wars, Napoleon had now lost 2 in a row, and this time there would be no sneaky comebacks. The Allies had learned from the mistake of sending him to actually not all that far away Elba. This time, they didn't take any chances. The French emperor was exiled to St. Helena, literally one of the most remote inhabited islands on planet Earth. Napoleon would live there until his death on the 5th of May 1821 at the age of 51. He was buried on the island, but in 1840 his remains were returned to France, and they now rest beneath the dome of the magnificent Les Invalides in Paris. Historians can't seem to agree on how best to categorize the remarkable life of Napoleon Bonaparte. To some, he was a tyrant who betrayed the revolution that made him. To others, he was a hero who changed the world, mostly for the better. Some view him as a power-hungry megalomaniac intent on conquering the world. Others believe he was simply protecting French interests against relentless European aggression. Either way, his influence on the history of our species cannot be overstated. After his death, his many reforms and innovations across law, education, economics, and civil administration were replicated all over the world. Some of them remain in place, even today. And something that's in no doubt whatsoever is his almost supernatural military genius. It's hard to sum up just how remarkable Napoleon was, so I'm not going to even try. Instead, I'll leave you with the words of the man who finally vanquished him. In the years after Waterloo, the Duke of Wellington was asked to give his opinion on who was the greatest general of the age. His answer was simple. In this age, in past ages, in any age, Napoleon. Thanks for watching. Our history has been pockmarked with warfare, and unfortunately, things haven't changed all that much since the days of Napoleon. Sadly, it's often animals and our beautiful natural environments that become the victim of humanity's conflicts. I support Planet Wild because they're actually putting into action what many of us wish we could do but don't have the resources to. They carry out a new rewilding mission every month. They work with wildlife pioneers worldwide to bring back endangered species, clean up our oceans, and revive forests. And by supporting them, you are directly supporting these missions to restore our planet's environments and put things right. I really love Planet Wild's transparency. They document their work in monthly video reports on their YouTube channel, and they have an app which allows you to vote how you'd want your funds to be used, so you can actually see the difference you're making. On their latest mission, Planet Wild are planting 40,000 trees and learning more about forest gardens, a genius approach to tree planting and a natural solution to overcome desertification. If you want to join a growing community making a real difference protecting our ecosystems, check them out and consider becoming a supporter. The first 200 of my subscribers to use the code 42 will get their first month for free. Click the link in the description below or just use the QR code on screen right now. Also, make sure to check out Planet Wild's channel right here on YouTube. The link for that is in the description too. A big thanks to Planet Wild for sponsoring this video, and please don't forget to check them out because what they're doing is genuinely amazing.